Hi, everybody. My name is Alexis Boylan, and if you are watching the video, we are already being upstaged fabulously. And our guest will not only introduce herself, but also her dog, who is brilliant already and spectacular. My name is Alexis Boylan, and I am a professor of art history and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. I am also the director of academic affairs at the University of Connecticut for our Humanities Institute. And I am finally and very excited to be the curator of the exhibition and project Seeing Truth. And I am very excited today to be talking to an artist who I believe the first time I met her on Zoom, I said, "Oh my God, I'm a huge fan," and proceeded to fangirl out in a pretty embarrassing way. The opportunity to talk with and work with one of my favorite artists. So yeah, fangirled out. Had a real T-Swifty moment about my guest. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself. And I already sort of messed it up by announcing that you are an artist, but I'm going to let you introduce yourself. But before, I also just want to, as always, thank the Luce Foundation for their generous support of both the Seeing Truth exhibition and the projects and dialogues that are accompanying it. So with that, Penelope, would you like to introduce yourself? Because I hate introducing people, and because I also am always fascinated by what people say about themselves.
Okay. Well, when you asked me to say who I was and what I do, I just was like, okay, well, I'm a person and I make
You know what? All the facts are important. Give us the data that we need.
Those
Yes.
And I have a dog.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the said dog's name? Just so we
know. That was Franklin.
Okay.
We'll keep that in the video. You met Franklin. Yes.
Fabulous.
He's now going for a walk.
So what do you do besides being Franklin's caretaker, owner, buddy, and friend?
What do? I teach and I make art and I show my work. And I also, have a fairly consistent domestic life also, but that I wish I had more of that actually anyway.
Yeah. So you are an artist. Do you want to tell people who are just becoming sort of acquainted with your work, the kind of work that you do, and a little bit of your sort of story of even sort of becoming an artist? I'm going to ask you in a minute about sort of data stuff. So maybe don't dive right into that, but just sort of to give those who maybe don't have so much of a background, who are not fangirls like myself, a little bit about sort of the kind of work you make.
Okay. How long do you want me to talk about that? Because I could go back to when I was 7.
You know what? That's the first and last question, and then we're totally done. No, just kidding. Like pretend we're on an airplane. Okay. Like give me the airplane pitch.
Oh, the airplane pitch. Okay. Well, I'm a photo-based artist.
Okay.
And I mostly find images to use. And actually, ever since I can remember, like from the time I was little, I was making things with things that I found. So there's a kind of theme throughout my entire life of finding things and being kind of inspired by them and not really understanding them. And through the working with them, understanding something about the world. So basically, I think about my process as being sort of like using the materials in the world to understand something about the world.
Okay. That's good. That's a good elevator pitch. I got it.
Okay.
So I'm going to actually now deep dive a little bit into that, because the work that we're going to be showing in Seeing Truth, and a lot of the work that you have really been focused on in the past couple of years, has been around data and data that you've collected from the internet. And I use those words like very advisedly, or not advised by you, but I'm using them very specifically to sort of provoke you into a certain conversation. And because I'm interested in sort of what about the sort of visual world on the internet has become so provocative to you, and what is it that you find about that data and that way of looking at data, visual data specifically, that's interesting to you?
Visual data. I think that it has to do with the idea of the collective. So when you see the same thing repeated many times, you can start to understand something about who we are as human beings, or who we are in a particular culture. So the more of something that I can find that is interesting, the more material I have to work with, and the more it kind of points to something that reveals an aspect to our culture or humanity. And yeah, and it's interesting to think about data on the internet, because it wasn't actually that interesting to me until the internet became collaborative, right? Like when people could start posting stuff. So it's really, before we had Instagram, before we had Flickr, before we had even people selling things on Craigslist and eBay, all the images, all image production was either really personal and stayed in the home, or it was corporate or commercial. And so what's really interesting right now, I think, is that image production is more collective. And I wouldn't say democratic.
Right.
There's this whole thing about democracy and the democratization of photography, which I actually think photography has actually in some ways become more tyrannical, the medium itself, but everybody is using it and everybody's sharing what they photograph. So, and that ability to share and then find is really fascinating, because it really tells us something about who we are, I think.
So I can't help myself. And I warned you that this was going to happen. So 2 questions to your answer. And the first is, I find it really interesting that you, in your answer about what you find provocative about visual data, you actually don't mention at all the object that is visualized. Like, so I think after I became so sort of focused on the images that you were going to be showing in the show, I started actually following on Twitter, like just a random, like, images of the moon every day. And what I find interesting is that you didn't mention at all sort of like the subject being like the moon or the subject being Earth or whatever, that you were more interested in these images as evidence, as opposed to evidence of humanity than as perhaps objects of themselves.
I'm more interested in the images as a kind of currency in a way, right? Okay. And so actually the best example that I can use is the images that I work with that are from Craigslist and eBay, because those images are taken by sellers who want to sell the object. So the images themselves are not interesting to them, but the object is the important thing. And those images are just throwaway images. And to me, the object is not interesting at all, but the photograph is really interesting. So I get to use these photographs that were garbage, basically, to the person who took them. And I think the same thing that happens with the work that I did with the moon and the sun and the other side of the moon, sort of screen grabs. It's not so much the fact that it's an image of the moon, it's the fact that someone found an image of the moon and then made this effort to illustrate something and then share it. So it has this kind of currency to them, not of the moon, but of like what the image is worth. Right. Or how the image can validate something. Yeah.
So, and now I'm going to push back to another point you made, because I just can't help myself. I want you to talk a little bit more about the tyrannical photograph. I have not heard, certainly there's a very long history of people thinking that photography has a tyrannical effect. I'm interested though, because that's not what it seemed like you were talking about. What it seemed like you were talking about is that in this historical moment, the medium and the ability to take photographs, and they're not really photographs in any kind of like, the technical, like to take so many images, you seem to be suggesting is actually restricting our ability to maybe use that medium in new and creative ways. Is that how I understood? Am I understanding?
I guess what I meant was that there's a certain kind of assumed subjectivity and individuality and uniqueness to everybody's vision, right? So when you pick up a camera or your phone or whatever, and you want to take a picture, that inclination, that need to take the picture is based on like, oh, I see something that I want to either keep, or I see something that I want to share because it's unusual. I have a good way of, there's an ego element in it and a subjective element in it, or there's the assumed subjective element in it. And what's fascinating to me is, art photographers aside, most of the images that you see on Instagram or on what used to be, the early Instagram, which was Flickr and basically any sharing platform, follow very specific scripts for taking photographs. And so there's that element of the scripted photograph, which is like the narrative that we are trying to tell each other who we are, or trying to tell each other, you know, I'm having this great time or whatever. It follows these scripts that I think are tyrannical.
Mhm.
But the other aspect of it is that all the technologies are only allowing us certain ways of photographing, right? So they're all, you know, they're exposing for certain things, they're dictating basically how we photograph, and they're dictating the look of the image. So that's what I meant, that,
Yeah,
you know,
I'm not going to push on it because I feel like I would want to talk to you about that for hours, because
yeah.
I do think that it runs into this really interesting conversation though about how free was photography really ever, that we were
Right.
always sort of like trapped by this technology that we may or may not sort of.
I think that we were at some point invested and had a kind of active agency within the process of making or taking photographs.
Right.
And I think now most people don't. And, you know, I think the job of the artist or the job of the photographer, like professional photographers, or, you know, people whose live, you know, who are invested in the medium, the job is to unpack what it, you know, there's no way now that we can know the mechanics of our phones or our cameras, right? Like we used to have boxes, we understood how the light came in and how the exposure was made, and we understood the chemicals that produce the image. And there's no way we can understand that now, but we can at least try to unpack it a little bit and sort of understand what the parameters are that we are working with. But I would say that most of the photographs that we see online, nobody understands that and nobody cares about that.
Right.
So, yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
As I said, I could go on, but I'm gonna try to stick to the questions that are pertinent to the exhibition and that sort of thing. One of the questions and themes of the Seeing Truth exhibition is the line between data, supposition, deduction, and creativity. And your work really pummels, I think, these ideas. Like, you force the viewer to think about things that are often given or not looked at, or looked at for a specific reason and then sort of tossed away. But I was sort of wondering, what do you think lies between data, supposition, deduction, and creativity? And then what is it that you're looking to say between these spaces? And I'm thinking now specifically about the pieces that we're going to be showing in Seeing Truth, which focus on the sort of imagery of the moon and the sun and the repetition of those images. I'm interested in sort of what it is that you are looking to comment on in terms of sort of knowledge making, because I mean, so much of that information is sort of on the internet, and so many of those images are on the internet in this kind of educational capacity, or NASA has put these images on the internet. And so I guess I just was sort of wondering what, like sort of between the data and your process and creativity, but then also for what you want the viewer to have happen to them when they look at your work, like what are those spaces like for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that it starts from my own experience of the platforms. And, you know, I think within the creative process, there's always a kind of reciprocal sort of symmetry, that if you as a maker are discovering something, then hopefully your viewer is also discovering that along with you, right? So for me, the work that's in the show, in this exhibition, part of it is a discovery of the form of the moon within a search platform. And so I'm not even really thinking about the internet as much as I'm thinking about the platform on the internet and how the platform subjugates, I guess, or how the platform organizes natural phenomenon. So the natural phenomenon are the pictures of the moon, and then it's organized within this kind of search platform, in this kind of array grid that denaturalizes it. And then I guess the dark side of the moon, or the other side of the moon, is just a kind of fascinating subject on a screen, because a screen is all about visibility and like access. And then there are people that are posting images that they found of the other side of the moon, and then making all these kind of diagrammatic markings about UFOs and aliens and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I guess I was just immediately fascinated by that, right? Like that people were doing that. And then also just the form of how that, if you did a search of it on various platforms, you get these different kinds of gridded forms that present that material to you in this kind of graphic array. And that graphic array of that platform to me is also really fascinating, because it's like this underlying structure that, in the same way that we don't know what's inside our phone, we don't really think about the structures of the web as being influential in how we think about nature, for instance,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the algorithms are already pitched. I mean, if we're like doing a Google image search, they're already arranged according to the searches we've done before, who Google has imagined that we are. And it's not even imagined, like who they actually know that we are based on all of the other. I mean, it's interesting because it does seem like a through line is your interest in actually what knowledge we're even able to access, that you're suggesting in a number of your pieces, but also in your sort of suggestion about the tyrannical nature of photography, that we don't even know what we're allowed to see and not see, because so much of it is being invisibly formed for us. And I do think that it's interesting because your work then plays so much with repetition. So again, the sort of dulling of our senses almost to what we're being given, I think is also this component of your work that I find really sort of fascinating.
Interesting.
I'm interested to sort of think about how you then think about sort of like scientific work. And I mean, NASA is on this massive project right now. And if you follow, like I am a nerd and I follow NASA on Instagram, and the images are phenomenal. They do nothing to really talk to us at all about how they've created these images. And they do sort of pass them off as like, these are
like, yeah,
photographs of, of space, and, not even anywhere suggesting that they've manipulated color, that they've actually invented the color, because all they have is data. I mean, what do you feel? I mean, and in that sense, I'm like, well, if NASA is a creative artist, then like, does that displace you? Like, or are you now a scientist, right? What you study is data retrieval.
Yeah, I think we have to sort of, this question gets asked to me a lot, am I a curator? Am I an archivist? Am I a collector? And then now you're adding, are you a scientist? Or are they an artist? And I think that one thing that you have to keep in mind, or one should keep in mind, and what I always say about my own work is that those are all processes for me. Like the process of archiving, or the process of looking at archives, or the process of collecting and aggregating, the process of curating the images that I collect, those are all means to an end. And then the end is something very specific. And it's like, how do I push and massage and tease out and, steep and, do all those kinds of things that push a certain kind of way of thinking and way of working with materials that is how I do, it's like my work, which I have no problem authoring, right? Like that's my authorship in that work. Even though multiple people have authored the images that I'm using, they can easily translate into my own work because as I said earlier, they're kind of scripted. I think that, when we talk about NASA, yes, they are coloring, but they're coloring in service to something completely different, right? Like it's not an artwork that they're making. It's for the purpose of illustration. It's for the purpose of, yeah. So that's how I would distinguish how,
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I think it's fascinating. I mean, I would argue, I think you're being very kind to NASA, but so I'll say there's something about those images that actually really reminded me, and when you were talking earlier about like the Etsy shots or the Craigslist shots, that there's something that is kind of like, this is what awesome space looks like, that is sort of meant to sort of elicit this thing where you like look past maybe like what are the specifics of this, and that you're just supposed to instead focus on being sold this idea of speak,
Right.
and again, I think because, well, there's lots of reasons but I think that, it's not unrelated to a longer history of conquest and colonization and all
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So,
And I think that's really fascinating to me, especially when it comes to, some of the, well, just these illustrations that I'm using in the screen grab prints that I made. There's something about naming and putting your mark on those images that is almost colonialist, right? So like the whole Google Moon project in some ways is a kind of colonialist project, and
absolutely.
definitely you could say NASA is. And although, we really love it, it's like really great.
Well, they sell it, right? Like what's not to love?
Yeah.
If you look at those photographs, right? They're using some strategies. I mean, not to
Right.
be all art historical about it, but
We're
some of these
talking about,
strategies are 19th century landscape,
yeah,
strategies, like
right.
big
They're
color.
coloring them to make them beautiful and seductive, but I still think it's for a different reason, right? Like I'm not trying to sell, well, I would love to sell my work, but I'm not selling a whole, well, I mean, we could say that there are kind of similarities to the idea of convincing the worth of the work, right? Like convincing an audience that the work that NASA is doing is worthwhile, convincing another audience that the work that I'm doing is worthwhile.
But I think you are also, I mean, your images won't loose the viewer from thinking about where do all these images come from? What is my relationship to this technology? I think
that's important in my work. Actually, it's
absolutely,
like,
yeah, no, that is like the thing that I think is really provide. It's why I actually a little bit bristled when you said like, oh, some people say I'm just a collector. Like so much of what you do is push us to think about a collective way in which we all sort of take in these materials and digest them or don't, and the way that we are voracious for them, and then also
for images also.
Absolutely, yeah,
Like,
no,
well, I
absolutely.
guess that's what you're talking about. Yeah.
So, and the next question I have is going to be a little bit afield, and this is going to be very particular to, I have to say, an article that came out this week. I was writing the questions for you and just also fuming about the New York Times has literally for the past, like, I don't know, it feels like every week they have an article, and the variation of it is that these new AI art production, AI art aggregators are destroying all things about artists. And then, so like a couple of weeks ago, it was like somebody won an art contest in like Des Moines with an AI, like they typed in 7 words or whatever, and an AI image came up and that's what won. And so, art's dying. And then this week's thing was like, well, some artists say that they're going to be able to use this AI. Like it was sort of like, then it was like, okay, we're still narrating a total like apocalyptic narrative about creativity and artists and the hand.
So we've been doing that for centuries too, right? Every new technology.
Right. Yeah. It's all downhill from like starting back right away. Yes. But I was actually just sort of wondering, I mean, they love their dramatics, but you actually use this technology in a very different way, and not this technology.
Yeah,
but I am really interested in how you feel about, because this technology is about sort of what you do and then dissolving all of the ideas all of the critical inquiry that you put into it, and then just are like, look, this is all, like you said, hot dog and Trump. And so I've made you this Trump hot dog thing. And also this sort of way of imagining that one could utilize all the images that exist in the world and therefore have all the sight in the world, and therefore, I guess, monetize it or democratize it or any of the other sort of utopian or dystopian words you want to attach to it. So I was actually just sort of wondering if you would speak to that a little bit. And again, I know that that's not exactly your wheelhouse, but I actually do think that it made me think a lot about your art and the way in which you think a lot and push audiences to think a lot about, like, how do I even get in to see an image?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people ask me about, what I think about AI, and I'm just fascinated by it.
Mm-hmm.
Like really fascinated. And I love all the crap that's coming out of it, as well as sort of the interesting things. I mean, I think that it could be really problematic, but it could also be really amazing in the future,
Right.
like once it becomes smarter or whatever. And I think that's true of all technologies. Like there's a lot of crap and bad stuff that happens with every single new technology.
Right.
And there's also good stuff. So I love that you say, and because I never thought about this before, but that yes, the way we think of AI right now, especially image AI, is aggregating all the images, which is kind of what I do too. But I have to say that, like, one of the things about what I do from the very beginning, people had asked me, do I use search algorithms? There are a number of different apps that I could use to find whatever it is that I'm looking for. And one of the things that is so fundamental to the way I work is that I'll be working on something and I'll see something and I'll go, wait, what? And I'll then start to dig into that. And if it has a kind of psychological or emotional or cultural resonance that I can't figure out, but that's really fascinating, I'll work on something for 8 or 9 months before I even know what it is that I'm doing. And it has to have that kind of depth of weirdness, like either psychological or whatever, in order for me to even sustain that practice around that subject for that amount of time. And I think that's the biggest difference between what I do and what like an AI or a search algorithm could do. And that is that, it's one thing to get all the images. It's another to really question a kind of image and then feel it, like really feel the weirdness of it, and then make work coming out of that.
I love your sort of suggestion that it's not about like fixing an algorithm, because it's like there's a kismet to that too, right? I mean, I imagine that it depends on like what kind of a day you're having and how has Franklin been that actually it's all of these mysterious other things that collide with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit deeper than the kind of day that I have, because these
Oh
projects.
yeah. No, but
yeah. Well, okay, I did. I mean, 2 of the projects I could just speak to right now that really started off from personal experience. Very, very early project was these mirrors from catalogs, and it was before the internet. And the only images that I had to work with really were commercial images.
Right.
And I'd been getting like these home decor catalogs that these companies send to you, and I had stacks and stacks of them, and I'm like, what? There's got to be something here that I can work with. Right. And then one day my bathroom mirror broke. It just fell and shattered all over the floor, and I was like, I cleaned it up, and then I didn't replace the mirror for a couple of weeks. And every time I go to wash my hands, I'd look up and I really had this strong sense of disappearance. Like I was like, whoa, I just disappeared, because I so used to just seeing myself when I wash my hands. And so that started this project of looking through the catalogs at the mirrors, because when you look in those catalogs at those mirrors, nobody's in them. So you have this, so I blew them up, and you stand in front of them and you are disappeared. So, and I guess the reason I'm telling you about this project is that for me, that is where it starts. It's like a feeling and an experience. And it's not just simply, wow, I could get 3,000 images if I went to look for this. It starts from this, like investigation that has to do with a relationship to something that I'm having online, or
Yeah, I mean, I think I misspoke when I was sort of suggesting like it's nothing as like banal as just like
bathroom mirror
happened in my day. But
yeah.
I actually think
I use that because it is that actually.
Yeah, but I think that it's the banalness of actually our humanity, right? Yeah. Of like of the day, of just all of those small pieces that come together. And also the sort of the whole process of the conscious and the unconscious. I do think that sort of the interesting discussions about AI are about sort of like what is conscious and what is unconscious, and what what might be happening within the algorithms that have maybe different layers to them. But yeah. So you personally as an artist are not feeling the New York Times hasn't gotten you all hyped up. You're not frightened of AI. Do you have
No.
have you played around with any of the?
I've been playing around with them for a long time, like just the very beginning ones, like, you know, mainly because I teach and my undergrad students are fascinated
Right.
by it. So they often come in with these projects.
Right.
And then I'm like, oh, what app is that? Or, oh, what
Right.
platform was that? And so we fool around with it a bit. And then I fooled around a little bit with DALL-E, but I just thought it, I don't know if DALL-E or whatever it's called. I did actually, you know, take a few screen grabs of what they thought a cat was.
Mm.
Like you just put in one, you know, like, and thought maybe I'd do something with that, but like, you know, like if you put in the most banal thing, like just one thing, and you get a bunch of things that don't look at all like that thing, you know.
Right.
That's kind of
Right.
fascinating to me. The failures, I mean, all of the work that well, a lot of the work that I am focused on are the failures of the technologies that we use. So yeah.
Right. Sort
Yeah.
of this the slip between the desire and then the reality of it. So
Right. And the promise of what it can do for you, and then just letting it not do that.
and then yeah, no, it's funny. I saw a thing that was like all this time and we still have Microsoft Word, like that's still the best, you know, like it is this sort of like, oh, right, you know, like
Right.
it's
And then my favorite thing to do with Word is to put an image in it and ask it to tell me, you know, tell the picture description.
oh yeah.
That's always really hilarious.
Disaster. So I'm going to pivot you. We've been asking everybody this question about the instigator items for the show, because as you know, your pieces are going to be sitting and living with and inhabiting space in a constellation and environment with a number of pieces from the American Natural History Museum and the images that we picked as instigator items. So I was wondering if any, how do I want to phrase this? If any item instigated you towards happiness or sadness, anything provoke you, or any of the instigator items you couldn't stop looking at or that you didn't want to ever see again?
Okay, well, I have to say that I very quickly looked at them because I wasn't paying attention to emails for a couple of days. And I immediately was drawn to the little blue box with the polar bears inside.
Okay.
And I think it's partly because when I had kids, well, I have kids, but they're grown up. But when my kids were little, we made so many boxes like that. We made so many little dioramas. And I did a project at a public school, one of the Percent for Art projects, where I had the kids make dioramas. So I have a very close relationship to the making of dioramas, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that I think is really fascinating is, because I've been thinking about this, like, how would I justify thinking about that diorama in relation to my work, not in relation to my kids or a project that I did with kids. And that is that I think with all of my work, there's an element of categorization and compartmentalization, which probably has a lot to do with language, like how we think conceptually, but then gets sifted through the kind of formal ways that I work. And that little box with the polar bears in it is the epitome of like categorizing and boxing information, right? It's like this whole little world inside there, which is not unlike the screens that we're looking at right now. Like you're in a little boxy world and I'm in a little boxy world, and every window on a screen is one, and all the little squares on image platforms are little boxes. So I picked that image.
I mean, I think it's great because I think it totally, you're also like, you're hitting on the thing. I mean, that little box is also supposed to teach children how to go to museums and what to look for. Like, how do you know, what does an educational space of a polar bear look like, you know? And so you're already being taught to do this sort of disassociative moment, which I think is, I mean, I do think that actually really does relate to your work, and this sort of like, how are we being pushed into having certain, and then, I mean, I'm thinking now about the people who then draw on the images and sort of insert their ideas, like how do we resist the images that we are given and make something else, or try to sort of recreate
or celebrate those images? I mean, that's the other things. And I think what you just said, resist, is exactly that what I was talking about before, the thing that allows me to stay with something so long. It's got to have both, right? Like you look at it and you're critical of it, but you also just love it.
Right.
Right. So you gotta love it, or you just are miserable if you're going to
Right.
spend 8 months working on something, right? But you also have to question it, like really deeply question it. So,
Right.
and I think that little box is like that for me. It's like, why do we put animals in boxes? Why do we make these dioramas? It's so stupid and so weird on the one hand. On the other hand, it's so great. It's like so fantastic.
Right.
So, yeah.
And people literally travel all over the world to go to the American Natural History Museum to see the little box that they have been so prepped to see in various ways. No, I love it. And I will say, if you go on the website, there's this fabulous picture of the little truck that was made to take the little boxes around to school children all around New York.
I saw that.
I mean, I, of course, was like, do we still have the truck? And we don't. But I love the idea of actually then creating a vehicle.
A museum. Yeah.
Exactly. With the exact purpose of sort of recreating this sort of dioramas and that sort of thing. But this is a perfect moment to segue to our last question. And everybody hates this question, but I think this question is very instructive. And you're not allowed to answer more than one truth, but I want you to tell me one thing that you know is true, a truth about the world. And then how do you know it's true? And what evidence or data do you have about its truthfulness?
You said about the world, because I saw the question and I was like, oh, well, this is a nice recursive ending. And just like, okay, I know that I am a maker. And
you can say that though. That's a truth that you know. That is a truth.
And the evidence is that I make things.
Then you know what? It is the truth of you that you are a maker. And that it is also the truth of you that is how you've tried to find a way out of the question. That I find to be the most interesting part, is how everybody tries to sort of like,
I don't really know any truths about the world, right? Okay. Like,
well, you know one, apparently. You know a truth about yourself, and you are in the world. So yeah.
I have a dog.
I think it's a perfect way to start and end with the only things that either of us know are that we have dogs. And
I'm not even sure I'm a person, right? Like,
you're a person, you're a maker, you have a dog.
A brain in a vat. I might not know it.
You know what? There actually will be specimens in the exhibition. So it has been a joy to talk with you, Penelope. Thank you so much. And again, I just want to remind everybody that you get to see Penelope's amazing work that is being constructed right now. I just saw the emails flying past at the Seeing Truth exhibition, which opens at the Benton on January 19th. Super excited. And thanks again, Penelope.
Thanks for having me. It was fun talking to you.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.